Hey, let's start. Let me pray and we'll get going. Father God, thank you for the chance we have to meet together. Thank you even more for the chance we have to serve you. And it's my prayer, and I trust the prayer of each participant on today's call that we'll be able to better serve you by having invested an hour or so together with one another this morning. Ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So welcome
Amen.
aboard. I'm going to be your host today for our EFCA West Wednesday morning Zoom workshop. I'm pinch hitting today for Tim Jacobs, superintendent, who's away this week. And he asked me to kind of lead a discussion, do a little bit of a presentation, lead a conversation with you on the article that I wrote that was published in the Zipline that y'all should have received, or hopefully y'all received a couple of days ago. That was titled, "Are You My Pastor?" And if you're not familiar with how I was intending the underline and the italics and the bold and the word "my," it kind of refers to things from either the board member's perspective or the staff member's perspective, looking at their lead pastor or senior pastor, whatever your church calls it. It's just that question, like, are you my pastor? Are you being my pastor? Or are you my boss? Or like, what are you? Kind of a define the relationship moment. Do want to talk just briefly about the Zipline with us, as long as we're here and we're talking about a Zipline article. That's really our main district-wide communication vehicle. We're on Facebook and YouTube. We got stuff all over the place. But in terms of pumping stuff out to the masses once a month, Zipline is our thing. And we'd encourage you, pastors, most of you are pastors, if you just take the time to, you can manually enter your board member's email address into our subscription thing. It's always nice to send them an email, tell them you did it. They can unsubscribe if they want. But if you go to efcawest.org, that's the easiest way to get our page on the EFCA website. And down at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a button to push, and it'll pop up a screen and just ask for an email address. And if you put your staff and your elders or your board members' email addresses in that box, they'll start getting the Zipline, which is our main communication tool in terms of mass kind of communication throughout the district. So just encourage you to do that. EFCAwest.org. One word, EFCA West, and down at the bottom right-hand corner of that page, you'll find the way to subscribe to the Zipline. So again, just kind of introduction, let me share with you all a little bit about the Something to Talk About article. I looked at it this morning. Over the past, I'm a couple months shy of 7 years. But I've written 81 articles and published one repeat. So there are 82 editions of Something to Talk About. 81 of them are original, and they come out every month in the Zipline. And from time to time, I'll get comments back that they'll say, enjoyed that article, whatever. Every once in a while, I'll get a hate mail, but that's not very frequent. And typically the response is like, I really enjoyed your article, but I appreciate that, all the pieces, but the main thing I want is like, did you have a conversation about it? Did you actually talk with either the board members or staff members or somebody else? Because the topics are designed to be something to talk about. They're focused on issues that I like to use Stephen Covey's old model of stuff. It's been around for a long time, but they're important things that are not urgent. And because they're not urgent, we never talk about them because we're busy doing the things that are very time sensitive and kind of pressing on us. And so I just write once a month, just as a prompt, in the hopes that not only will you read them and perhaps, spur some thinking on your part, but perhaps you can have a conversation once in a while with your staff team or your board members or, whoever that might be germane to that particular article, to actually begin to work on some things together and to come up with some common understandings and expectations for one another and what we're going to do and the direction of the church and those kinds of things. So just encourage you to do that when you get the opportunity to review one of those articles, especially if it happens to be one that resonates and you go, yeah, this could be something to talk about. And I'd love to hear how those conversations go. As we go today, I'm going to do just a little bit of talking at the beginning, and those who know me know there'll probably be a lot of bit of talking. But just do a little bit to kind of explain some of the concepts that we want to have our conversation about today. And don't forget to use the little chat button there if you have a question that you want us to particularly talk about. Love to do that. And got one request by email before. We sometimes get those, so we have one of those that we'll already be talking about. And feel free to do that. I'm looking for some good conversation about this. I hope to learn some things. I hope you learn some things, and there's some things that you can share that'll be really productive for us this morning. But do be discreet. You do remember that you clicked on that "We're being recorded" button. So we want to know if there's one thing that most pastors and church leaders can do is they can be discreet if they put their mind to it. So feel free to share some things that are going on, and let's talk about some of the things that we've learned through our experiences, perhaps learning from the wisdom of others so we didn't mess them up, or perhaps being able to share some things we learned from the dumb text that all of us leaders have to pay from time to time. So the article that this month's article, "Are You My Pastor?" comes from something that I've been experiencing over the last 7 years or so that I've worked with EFCA West, and I've come to believe that the toughest church relationships to manage always seem to involve the senior pastor or lead pastor, and they almost always involve the lead pastor and a board, or the board member, or the board as a whole, or the lead pastor and a staff member. There still are conflicts between pastors, and congregants and that kind of stuff, but they don't seem to be quite as a whole, quite as incendiary, to have as big a negative impact and just, a weight on our hearts and our souls as we slog through the work of ministry, as does a conflict that we have with the board or board members, or with one of the staff members. And I think one of the things that has just been fairly common in my conversations with, again, all three of those groups, board members, staff members, and pastors, is just this idea like, I thought, is he my pastor, or is he my boss? Is he my leader, or is he my pastor? Can you lead and pastor? Can you supervise and pastor at the same time? Do you take hats on and off as we address different circumstances? So it's just like, what is the relationship for staff members? Typically the lead pastor, and I'll just probably use the word pastor just to make it easier, but the pastor is the boss. He's the person that's responsible to assign the work, to direct the work, to evaluate the work, to do all the things that a supervisor, manager, leader in an organization does. And that's a very strong relationship throughout the week as the work gets done, even in the best of teams. And yet at the same time, the pastor is the staff member's pastor. He's their shepherd. He's the one responsible for the care and the feeding and all the other things that go along with being a pastor for their staff member's soul. The same thing holds true for board members and elders, depending on what your church calls them, where in the boardroom, as a rule, the pastor is, although he's typically a leader, certainly in the areas in which he's skilled and gifted and those kinds of things, but he's also a peer. We're fellow board members. We oftentimes try to work through these situations as peers, as teammates, and we can have some pretty difficult discussions. And then on Sunday morning, you're my pastor, but are you my pastor in the boardroom? How do we bounce back and forth between those roles? Some of the pastors I've shared with, they especially in times of conflict, I just have to admit that most of the time when my phone rings, it's not someone telling me they're having the most glorious month of ministry that they've ever had. Usually they call and there's been some kind of an issue that they're confronting. And so, what I'm hearing may be slightly skewed to the negative, but sometimes pastors express that they feel like, they're having a hard time or even can't do their work of leading their teams, whether it's staff or boards, and perform the functions of being their shepherd at the same time. And I know that the reality is, my background, for those who don't know, I was in policing and spent, close to 40 years doing that. And that's not a role that you get to take on and take off very easily. It kind of follows you around wherever you go. And sometimes it's hard to figure out, like, am I looking at this like I'm Bob, or am I looking at this like I'm Officer Bob? What's the role that I'm playing in this relationship at this time in this particular situation? But I think the bigger reality beyond, the pastor wondering, like, can we do this? The group that struggles the most with this are board members and staff, as they look at the relationship that they feel like they're having with their pastor as he leads them. That they tend to be the ones that are the most confused, the most disoriented, or the ones whose expectations are unmet and result in hurt at a deeper level. One of the things that's true is that, that we as leaders, just as human beings, we cannot, I use the word disintegrate, meaning we were integrated, now we're not one, we're now separate part. We can't disintegrate ourselves into our roles and have a space between them. We are who we are, but what that dominant role that we're going to behave in can change from time to time based upon the circumstances that we face. And so what I find interesting is trying to work through the process of how do we choose what behavior we're going to exhibit as our primary behavior in dealing with the circumstance that we have in that pastoral or leader relationship with board members and with staff. There's something I wanted one last thing I wanted to share with you before we begin to open up a little with discussion. And that is, when I talk about board members and staff members struggling with, usually at a deeper, more intense level than most of the pastors I've talked with, it's because their expectations have not been met. They had expectations of how their pastor would lead them in the workplace or in the boardroom. And those expectations didn't come to fruition. They were unmet. And I've just discovered that in terms of relationships, it's been my experience that unmet expectations in any relationship is the primary cause of relational conflict. I expected, I tell the story, I tell a story at home where, I used to travel a lot in my last career. And I would, on my flight home, I'd be so happy to be coming home, and I would begin to develop this expectation of what it's going to be like when I walk into the house and I say hello to Charlene, my wife. And, our nest is empty, has been for a while. And so, it's like, there's going to be this glorious welcome. She's going to be just so totally happy that I'm back because I miss her, and I'm really, really happy to get home. And then I would come home and open the door and I'd say, Charlene, I'm home. And she'd say, welcome home, and be cooking dinner in the kitchen. And, there weren't balloons and confetti, and, the marching band didn't come through. And it was like maybe a little different, but sort of like any other day I came home from work. And I would find myself, that was disappointing because, and why was it? Because my expectation was, I spent all afternoon on an airplane, thinking about how nice it's going to be to get home. And this thing that Pete Scazzaro writes about in terms of talking about valid and invalid expectations really, really, really helped me, because it dawned on me that the reason I was, I'll say upset or frustrated or whatever, was not Charlene's fault. It was my fault, because I was holding her up to performing to invalid expectations. And Pete Scazzaro, there's my favorite page in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, deals with expectations, what's valid and what's invalid. And the first step that he mentions is a valid for expectation that I have to be valid. Let's say I have an expectation of each of you. For that to be valid, it has to be conscious. which means I have to know I have that expectation. So go back to my airplane flight and coming home, I knew I had that expectation. I knew what I was expecting. The second component is it realistic that that's going to happen? And, as I thought about it, that we could have balloons and confetti and, or at least metaphorically have that. But it certainly wasn't beyond reason to think that there might be, just this ecstatic, warm greeting when I walk in the door. The third component Pete Scazzaro uses the word spoken. I usually change that to communicated. And that means, did I communicate that with you? Did I tell you that that's my expectation? And right then and there, my little story of travel falls apart, because no, I've never communicated that moment in my life. Never, ever, ever, ever. And so it's like, how would she know? How would she know that I was expecting or hoping for the confetti and balloons and marching band and all that kind of stuff? She would have no idea, because I never told her. But every time I came home, I was slightly disappointed that I didn't have that, that championship, grade A kind of welcome that I envisioned all by myself. And then the fourth component is it agreed upon. Did she agree to do it? And of course, she can't agree to do it if I don't communicate it to her, and the same thing holds for, I think, for our staff in terms of expectations. Again, they run two directions, right? Is that oftentimes they have expectations of their pastor in terms of what the relationship is going to be, but we've never talked about it, never communicated what that relationship is to be. And it's never been agreed upon that we're going to do it that way. And so I oftentimes default, because most of our readers are pastors, I default in my writing to, let's talk to pastors about these issues, how our expectations feed into some of the conflicts and stuff that we do, or that we experience. And so what I'd like to do with most of the rest of our time is, first of all, certainly entertain some questions, but I'd like to, as you may have something you want to talk about, put into the chat box. I want to just interact a little bit with you and hear what you've done to perhaps cultivate these things, to clarify expectations, or lessons that you may have learned in terms of dealing with, just how to relate as a pastor to staff members and board members. And then we're also going to look at the other way around. I'm probably the only non-pastoral, non-staff board member on the call. So I'll share a little bit from my perspective as a board member, what I look for and what I really appreciate about my pastor. And we'll have those that are staff members kind of chime in, but I want to kind of divide it into three short chunks. The first is to have pastors talk about that pastor-staff relationship, and how do you engage pastorally in that relationship. And then after you've shared some things, have staff members that are on the call, have them go ahead and share some thoughts about how, maybe what they're looking for and things like that. Again, the purpose of this is to learn from one another and to listen to some things that perhaps we haven't. Then we'll talk a little bit about the pastor relating to the board relating to the pastor. And then hopefully we'll have time to get to the last one, which is always something on my mind as an elder at my church, is who shepherds the shepherd? Who is it that takes care of and, watches out for my pastor? I think that's my job to do as one of the elders, but I'd be very, very interested in what your perspectives are there. So want to kind of open the mic, go ahead and unmute yourself. If you have something to say, feel free to jump in. If you want to have something with some further discussion or commentary or question for me, by all means, dump it into the chat box, and we'll go ahead and address those. But any of you pastors have some insights or lessons learned about, how to communicate to your staff that you're their boss, but you're also their pastor?
So you're looking for the lead pastor people.
Okay,
to speak
there we go.
Yeah, mostly the lead pastor type. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, thanks, Bob, for being on. One of the things when I was with Reach Global, we always used to have what we call the DTR talk, define the relationship. What will this relationship be like? Will it be like this, or will it be like that? And helping to define the roles, the boss role, the non-boss role, the advisor role, those kinds of things. One of the things that's helped me in that is to try to do that early on in the relationship, maybe even in the hiring process, to figure out, okay, what's this going to look like? At one church I said, if my office door is open, knock and you can come in. If it's closed, don't even bother to knock. So that kind of helped the, how that kind of went. And I would say, certain times of the week, I'll just be available for concerns that you might have, whatever it might be, whether it's personal or ministry or job description or org chart or whatever. So that was one thing that I had. You have discovered maybe something like the DTR might help this process.
Yeah, a while back, one of our articles was define the relationship as DTR. I based that off my sons would come home and say, oh, back in their dating days, well, we had the DTR conversation, and that was always a monumental day. And Dave, you put in the chat box, can we put expectations on the job description? I don't know that necessarily that it requires the job description, but maybe although that's as good a place as any, but perhaps even just a separate document. My role as pastor to staff members, something like that, where a pastor can initiate that conversation, and then it doesn't get tied up in potentially in employment litigation issues or conflicts necessarily about job performance. But again, we're clear. I'm a big fan of writing things down, just because the written word is more easily remembered 3 years down the road than the spoken word. Whether we heard it or we spoke it. So it's a lot easier if we write some of those things down, especially in a brief way. Dave Arnold, did you have something?
Well, I was kind of resonating with Matt Patterson. He had a question, and I can relate to Matt's question in the sense, okay, if you don't have a multi-staff church, which I relate to, right now we're even in transition. Our paid staff is we have 2 half-time staff. So most of my line ministry staff are volunteers. As a matter of fact, all of them. And I think a question that's been really helpful that I think I heard Andy Stanley say the first time is just trying to have a touch point with them every time that we're in the same building, like on a Sunday, for example. Just really ask, what can I do to help? Because I think that opens the door to a variety of possibilities. In other words, that gives an opportunity if there is a more of a pastoral kind of, hey, I'm struggling with, my parents are sick, or my son or daughter sick, or, I'm struggling with this, or the technical, hey, can you help me get the computer working? I think it's a broad enough, I think asking those open-ended kind of questions and just making sure, I think back to David's part about the job description, while it's not in formal job description sense, but the expectation, how are you doing in a community group? How is those sort of things working? And just trying to have those daily conversations. And then with our paid halftime staff, just, hey, is there anything we need to talk about? Instead of a once a week meeting, it's like every day, just have like a 5-minute, in my schedule, like 5 to 45 minutes, potentially, depending on if something is serious, walking like, hey, Sherry, is everything all right? Anything we need to talk about? Just that they understand that the lines of communication are open. I think the other piece is, and the harder piece is the larger your church grows, is understanding who has time and who doesn't get time. In other words, that to carve out, that this group of people have access to me and other people do not, for me to effectively do that.
Yeah, and that can limit the expectations or can create relational conflict with church members. So the church that I attend, pre-COVID, I assume we're all in the same boat. We kind of scratch our head and wonder what size our church actually is today. Pre-COVID, we were, on a Sunday morning, we were in the 950 to 1,000 range. And we had long ago communicated to the congregation and to elders and staff that our lead pastor's shepherding role was focused and darn near restricted to staff families and board families. That's who he personally is responsible to take care of in a shepherding role, and we dispersed everything else. we give him, permission, if I can use that word. It's like if you have someone who's a good friend in the congregation, then by all means you're going to be their friend. But in terms of, I'm going to visit you in the hospital because I'm your pastor, we limited that, but we announced that to everybody. We probably need to make sure people know that from time to time, kind of that drip irrigation thing, especially to remind newcomers to have to modify their relationship. One of the things, Matt, with your question about paid staff and stuff, one of the other ways to kind of look at that is, I think sometimes we focus in terms of differentiating who is who and what should my relationship be with that person in terms of various depths of pastoring or leading. We tend to look at whether they're paid or not. And I would suggest we look at what is their role or not. And so when somebody in a church, I think this is especially germane for the smaller churches that don't have, maybe have one paid staff member, excuse me, would be to ask, what is the role this person plays? And if they're playing an important ministry role, then yeah, I'm your supervisor. And perhaps I need to identify the role I'm playing. One of the stories I included in the article was just, my learning process with Charlene, who would share with me things that are going on in her life. Oftentimes it, relates to her job. And she talked about a story or a frustration and all that stuff. Well, I'm a helper and a fixer. I'm a strategic, fix the system and make it go person. And so I would find she would share something, and then I would launch into this conversation about how we can fix that and work around it and make everything right again. And all she didn't want me to be her consultant. She wanted me to be her husband. So, excuse me. So I got to the point where in those conversations, I would just ask her what role she wants me to play. Do you want me to help you fix this, or are we just sharing our days with one another? And she said, we're just sharing our day, and it's great. I'm happy to do that. And then I don't have to worry about trying to fix anything. But sometimes I think because a pastor is really that biggest umbrella of leadership in the church, that it may befall the pastor in engaging those conversations to identify whether it's a pastoral conversation or a supervision conversation. Not that we can't do supervision conversations with a pastoral mindset, but just like, again, defining the conversation as well as the relationship that we're experiencing at the moment. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I actually, as a professional volunteer in ministry situations and churches for all of my adult life, I'm looking at what you wrote, Matt, and from my perspective, I would just say that I want my pastor to be the same person behind the pulpit or wherever you're teaching from as you are when you interact with me and see me and, say, hey, thanks for showing up. And I'd also like those chairs to be moved, 6 feet more over here. I think that'll be a better suit. So yeah, I and one of the role models that I see in this is my husband, who we own a business, and he has employees that are very loyal to him, that he also is very kind and generous with his time and their salaries and all those kinds of things. And so they just respect him, because Ron is the same person when he's giving them an evaluation or explaining why they did something that they should not have done, or why they spoke in a way to somebody that's not representative of him and our company. And yet he's able to do that in an encouraging way and care about them and see them. And I honestly think, as someone that has full-time almost volunteered in so many ways in the church, that whether it's a staff person or a volunteer, that's really what they would like from their pastor. So there's just this consistency, and you can direct me and tell me you don't like how I'm doing something, or here's a better way. And if I feel like you care about me and you see me as a person, I'm not just a vehicle to, accomplish purposes that are the pastor's dream and I don't even know what they are, whatever. It's really, really helpful. And I think it really, really creates loyal fans of the church leadership and the church.
Excellent point, Linda. The hypocrite is basically two-faced. And one of the things that is very troubling to me, and every once in a while I hear it, thankfully not too often, is the story when a church leader is one way in one circumstance and another way in another circumstance that are just incongruent. One is, you're all godly and spiritual and all that stuff. And the other one just feels like the deeds of the flesh instead of the fruit of the spirit. And it's important for us to have that kind of integrity. Any staff people want to jump in on the other side of that relationship? Linda did a good job of turning the page for us.
Well, I'll share. I'm sort of in between. I'm an associate pastor, but an elder. And so the lead pastor, is my supervisor / pastor. And I'm also on the elder team. So I think that can be a tricky place to be, especially for the lead pastor, because as a board, if the lead pastor were to, need to be disciplined or whatever, I'm part of that process. So that's a kind of weird, unique sort of situation. Thankfully, so our lead pastor just left about a month ago, a little over a month ago, but we had a really good relationship. So it wasn't ever a problem, if something came up, but it is challenging. And I think somebody mentioned, I can't remember, just that conversation, like we would talk a few minutes several times a day, connecting over just either personally or various ministry things. And I think that was really helpful for me as a staff person from the lead pastor for them to engage with me both personally, and then, I would be able to come and say, hey, this is going on. Do you have advice? Or, hey, you need to know about this kind of thing.
Yeah, Mike, you describe well the awkwardness of that scenario, which is one reason I usually don't recommend it. There are authors, who have written books quite to the contrary of that, but it is always awkward to be a subordinate employee, have a boss, have somebody be my boss in the office, but then when I walk in the boardroom, I'm his peer / supervisor. It's just kind of awkward. So yeah, it's just, that's just really hard to do, especially if there's a concern, because you've got a lot of added layers that you have to support, so that you don't completely sabotage the working relationship as well as the board relationship. It can be very, very difficult. Any other staff want to speak up? Let's go ahead and change gears. Pastors, I'm interested in how you see your role of being the pastor for your board members. How does that work? How does that play out in the boardroom? And then I'll share with you, because again, I'm assuming I'm the only non-employee board member on the call as I look at people. I see Eldon Peterson's dog. Hi, hey Eldon, good to have you on the call. But go ahead, guys.
I'll say, actually, one of my roles was because I knew the lead pastor and I would talk a lot. So when he would bring things to the board, I could help bring clarity. Like if a board member wasn't understanding it, I could bring clarity like, oh, this is kind of what, you're missing this part of this aspect that of a conversation that you didn't hear. But also then I could, for the pastor, say, hey, you're not hearing what so-and-so is saying, or you're not really grasping kind of their question. And I could help with that kind of stuff. So it is a unique situation. And I hope I can continue that sort of buffer between the two, of where I have more understanding of what the pastor is saying because we've had conversations, and I can help the pastor go, oh yeah, okay, I see this guy's point.
Anyone else want to dive in? Dave?
As speaking as a lead pastor, senior pastor, I think navigating those two hats of shepherd leader, you're asking how we navigate that in a practical way in a meeting. I think posture, matters. So I always want to communicate to whether it's we have elders, deacons, and deaconesses, and we meet monthly together. And then then it's elders, we meet every Tuesday for elder prayer time. So that way there's an ongoing conversation. But always, from me, the posture is I always try to be the last to speak, if that makes sense. So we'll throw out, here's an issue, let's talk about it. And then as there's conversations about the agenda of running a church, just being sensitive, where is there a spiritual discipleship issue that we can step in? The last part of our monthly meeting is a book club. So we'll go through the book, and many times I'll choose a book that I've seen in our leadership, an issue kind of coming up, that we can get a book that we can start reading and kind of doing that pastor discipleship piece in with that process. But I think really just trying to serve and trying to, even if I think we're back to expectations, I think we cannot agree on a decision, but if people feel valued and heard, that goes a long way to supporting the decision. So we just had and maybe all of you in staff are maybe wrestling with this question. So how do we handle people, like if you had masks and people left the church that have been going to another church for 7 or 8 months, and then they decide to come back just because now we're not wearing masks? How do you handle those kind of conversations? And so I just threw out to our volunteers that run community groups, how do you guys think we should handle it? And just let them give their perspective on that. And if they feel like they're heard and valued, and then when you recognize, like, hey, that's a great point, thanks, I think that helps build that bridge to the pastoral piece, that actually it's not a transactional, like, okay, we need to vote on this on the agenda, but hey, let's talk about this and allow unfiltered conversation. Back to Lencioni, the 5, that trust and the 5 dysfunctions of the team framework. Just, I think that exposes and provides an opportunity in the pastoral piece, like, hey, Joe, in the meeting, I saw this, let's talk about, and so you can kind of switch that hat in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense to me. I think one of the things I scribbled some notes as I was anticipating our call this morning, as I was thinking about what may come up. And a thought crossed my mind that I think often, and perhaps this is to our detriment. In fact, I would suggest it probably is, that we tend to think, when we think of the word pastor, we tend to think of a role that we play or a position that we have in the hierarchy. And in reality, what it is a scriptural metaphor that defines a relationship between two humans, or a human and another group of humans. And, it's like, what does, oftentimes I think sometimes it would be cool. I know one of our churches has done it, and it feels a little weird to many of us, but they've done away with the word pastor and started using the word shepherd to just kind of make that metaphor just right out in front, make it the obvious thing. But it's like, I was thinking through what is it that a shepherd actually does? When I think like, what do I want my pastor to do? What does a shepherd do? And I scribbled down some thoughts. A shepherd cares for the sheep, right? And there's actual, watching out for their welfare. A shepherd feeds the sheep. We translate that into, a teaching thing. A shepherd leads the sheep. And that to me is the hardest one to be a sheep in terms of relationship to the shepherd, because in terms of leading, what a shepherd does is a shepherd moves the sheep from where they are to where they need to be. And most sheep are happy where they are. They would just as soon stay where they are instead of move to some new place. But that's the essence of leading. A shepherd actually trains sheep. Where to find food, where to get stuff, how to move as a flock. A shepherd disciplines sheep. Shepherd has that stick thing, and they'll whack the sheep to get them to move. Shepherds guard the sheep, prevent the harm from coming outside. Jesus said the good shepherd, he was a good shepherd, and he knows his sheep, and they know him, and he knows them by name. And I struggle with that know them by name part, especially as churches get larger. And then the shepherd is with the sheep. Shepherd is surrounded by sheep. That's what makes them a shepherd. They walk among the sheep. They walk in front of the sheep. They walk behind the sheep. They're there, present. And I think sometimes if we can think of being pastors from the perspective of having a shepherding relationship with the humans that are under my, area of responsibility. And again, I don't like the word under, let's say they're in my area of responsibility. Then I think that can help us actually exercise the functions of being a shepherd with our fellow board members. I do want to share kind of some things as a board member, some things that I really appreciate about my current pastor. I've known him since he got out of seminary. Our church was the first church he worked at, and about 10 years later, he became our lead pastor. The circumstances weren't planned, but that hopefully he would become our lead pastor when the other one retired was certainly in our mind when we hired him in the first place. And so I've had the privilege of having relationship for a long time. But I was thinking, like, John is his name. I was asking myself, how does John shepherd Bob? How is John Bob's shepherd? When we get in the meeting, we have some fun times before, because I'm the chairman of our board. And so as we put agendas together and do all that kind of stuff, it's, we've had some very interesting, pointed conversations, even some level of conflict. But I've never lost sight of the fact that John is my pastor. Even though he's my peer and he's my leader in some aspects. And some of the things he does that really reinforces that for me is that when he offers criticism or praise, he does it really constructively for me. There are some behaviors that I've thought I've grown out of that apparently I haven't. And from time to time, after a meeting, John will hang around and say, Bob, we need to talk. And he'll say, Bob, you fell into fill in the blank again. Don't do that. And it's like, thank you, John, for helping me. He's taking care of me. He's guarding me. He's protecting me from myself. He preaches and teaches really well, and I appreciate when I sit in church, when I come to church, I always say as an elder, I come to work. Like everybody, all the staff members and stuff do. There's a job I do, but I also come to worship and to be fed. And I get fed regularly. Our pastor lets me be me, lets the other elders be me. He doesn't try to mold us into something that we're not, even in our meeting places. He encourages us to exhibit our own unique giftedness and talents and those things. One thing he really does well is he engages in conflict well. And we've had conflict, some of it external, most all of it external. Every once in a while, it'd be something internal that we have a hard time with. And he just leads with a shepherd's heart through that. He's attuned to how people are feeling and those kinds of things. And he actually asks the spiritual question, like, Bob, what is going on in your soul? As that might be fueling your objection to whatever it is we were considering. He asks about how we're doing. legitimately, not in bad. Hey, Bob, how are you? Not to that level. It's like, Bob, are you doing well? You know, how's your family? How are you doing during COVID, Bob? You know, I mean, I've had that conversation several times. And then obviously when we have a difficult time, he's very pastoral in our midst, very, very pastoral. So I really appreciate that. I see in my pastor the ability to really navigate those two roles, to be a decisive, opinionated leader, as well as to do that with a shepherd's heart at all the time, but without hurting that shepherd relationship. I want to talk about a couple of things, if I can jump into the chat. Alex asked the question about, you know, the larger church, is it a different dynamic? And I would say absolutely. It all relates to role, function, and capacity. As the church gets bigger and bigger, any one human can directly lead fewer and fewer people. So the really big church, in fact, I'd say in a really big church, oftentimes what we call the lead pastor is really fulfilling a visionary and a teaching role. I don't say that that's not being a pastor, but it's less hands-on in the day-to-day care of the sheep. Might be analogous to a really large flock, you know, that's more than one shepherd can handle, which is why I always say that's why we hire staff. We get to the point, there's more things that the one person that we, you know, pay to devote their efforts full time to the, you know, leading in the church can't do it anymore. So you hire additional staff. So yeah, I think it absolutely does change. And, you know, anywhere from, you know, mega church to the church of, you know, I usually say size and complexity. Complexity usually revolves around the number of staff you have. But, you know, anytime a lead pastor is responsible for the shepherding care of, you know, staff people, maybe, you know, more than, you know, 40 to 100 people, that's going to be really hard to do. Really, really hard to do. And so I like to keep those numbers. Who am I going to give day-to-day hands-on care to, week-to-week, month-to-month hands-on care to? Try to keep that number small enough that you as an individual pastor have the capacity to do it. And not all pastors are created equal in terms of their capacity to provide care. But again, let's talk about, it's something to talk about. Let's talk about those relationships so that we understand one another. And there was one other question that I wanted to get to, and then we'll still have some time for some other things, I think. I have to, oh, here it is. I set it down in the wrong place. And it was from Christopher Scott. Thanks for joining us, Christopher. And the question was, like, when a new pastor arrives at an existing church, how long does it take for people to accept him as the pastor? You know, the kind of the prevailing wisdom. Chris was saying, you know, some of the things that seminary would say is, you know, it can take 7 years or, you know, or so to do that. And, you know, I have an opinion on that. And I've read all that literature. I think that most often a new pastor to a church, and I'm talking the pastor who didn't grow up in that church, someone who came from the outside in to a church, that they typically hit their prime in terms of they're going full speed, somewhere in the probably 5 to 7 year range, which is why I consider it a tragedy. A lot of the conflict that seems to occur in year 3, you know, sometime around that, that just kind of seems to be a thing. And it always saddens me when a pastor's done a lot of work for 3 years and then stops, because I just have this feeling like, could you keep working through that for 2 more years and see if you hit the magic 5? But again, the reality is that every congregation is different. That's probably, you know, when I started working with EFCA, I thought all churches are going to be basically alike. And I just, that's probably the biggest lesson I learned, is that they're hopelessly different. Hopefully the theology is pretty mainstream and all that stuff, but the people that are there and the mindsets, feelings, and backgrounds and behaviors that they bring are just ridiculously unique. And so some churches are just going to take longer because, you know, they're the church that, you know, crosses their arms at every new thing that they tend to be, you know, doubting and that kind of stuff. Others are just open arms. And then sometimes we find that the open arms church are wonderful for the first 2.5 years. And then boom, you touch, you know, something that my grandmother gave to the church, and now you're the enemy again. it just gets messy. And so what I typically suggest is that people work through it. Remember that, 5 to 7 is kind of, think of that bell curve, and about 80% of the bell curve is probably in that range. Your results may vary, and you may be the 10% on either side that seems to be forever. And there's always the likelihood that, an individual pastor is just not going to click in terms of culture and personality with the flock that they move into. Not all humans click really well with other humans. We can still love each other and care for each other and support each other and those kinds of things, but not every relationship clicks. So, again, and it depends. I think also we have to think about how we're defining the role of pastor. Are we defining that as a relationship, or will they, kind of shut up and follow me where I say to go, even though they don't want to, or they think I'm wrong? Those are kind of two different issues. One thing I will say that helps, and then I'll shut up, Dave, you can jump in. But one thing I think it will help is for us to understand, why is it that people choose to follow people? And 4 characteristics always come up in the best survey ever done over long-term, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. If the leader is honest, if they're perceived to be forward-looking, if they're perceived to be competent, and they're perceived to be inspiring, then people want to follow that person. And it doesn't matter if you're in the church or someplace else. Most everybody's going to want to follow that person. And unfortunately, sometimes we do find people in pastor positions who don't have one or more of those 4 things packed in their suitcase, and that can create problems. Dave, jump in.
Yeah, just to Christopher's really good question. I think the other piece, Christopher, is how much, for lack of a better word, transience do you have in your community? In other words, if you have a community where people are there for 3 or 4 years and then leave, and you're seeing that you have kind of a turnover in your church, that can slow kind of that momentum, because you're constantly having to go back to mission, vision, value, strategy, because you continually have a new group. So you may not feel like you're making the progress as quick, and you feel the temptation, like, why do I have to keep coming back to this? The problem is, if you don't come back to that, then then the expectation piece comes in. Like they're bringing their expectation from church X, and I've just moved here. And if you don't clarify that expectation consistently, if you have a lot of turnover because you're in a transient community, you're going to feel a lot of struggle of getting momentum and buy-in from folks, because they don't clearly understand what differentiates maybe the vision and mission that God has given you, opposed to the church they move from town X. And Bob, you can correct me if you're wrong, if I'm off base.
No, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I'll add to it. Most new pastors, when they come to a church, one of the first things they do is preach a sermon series on they'll pick a passage, but basically it's going to describe the church that they want to be. This is who we're trying to be. This is why we're here. This is what we're all about. This is what we're doing. And they do that because it's vitally important to get everybody on the same page. And then we never preach that series again. And we forget that 5 years later, maybe 50% of the church, 7 years later, 50% of the church has never heard that sermon. Right? They've never heard that. And so they're not necessarily on the same page. And that, to me, for the leader who teaches, from the pulpit is like, if I can use that picture, maybe a little outdated with some of the modern ways that we preach, but I'm still a little old school. But it's important that we continuously drip that vision and expectation, because every new person that comes to the church has never heard that. They don't have any idea unless we tell them. And so I just, encourage you to figure out, that's a hard thing to do, but just to figure, like, what are the really essential things about this church that everybody part of this church needs to know, understand, and support. And then we need to keep dripping that, probably every year. So if we're just doing drip irrigation, just keep dripping that in. If not, every 3 years, take 4 weeks or something and do a sermon series just to remind us of what we already know and refresh it and do those kinds of things to keep people moving forward. Yeah, Steve, the four things in the chat. Asked for the four things. I don't type real well, but it's honest. I want their leader, and these are the top four things that people, off a whole menu of things, they were asked, which 7 things are you looking for in someone you would choose to follow? And these 4 things were on well over 50% of all the responses, and the next highest one was in the mid 40s. So there's a big gulf between these 4 and everything else of a list of about 25, I think, characteristics. The big 4 is they want their leader to be honest. They want their leader to be forward looking. And that doesn't necessarily mean visionary. It can, but it's like, who wants to follow a leader that's going nowhere? You know, hey, jump on my train. I have no idea where I'm going. Nobody wants to do that. So honest, forward-looking, competent, meaning they can do their job. You know, in the business world, you know, if I supervise plumbers, it doesn't mean that I have to be a master plumber, but I need to have an understanding of plumbing. But I need to understand my role of running a business, you know, what that takes. And then the last one was inspiring. No one wants to be bored to death by their leader. You know, they want to be encouraged and inspired, and, you know, those kinds of things. So, yeah, I use that list a lot in various aspects of leadership training and coaching, and some of the consulting work I've been doing. Any other thing you want to share before we close this out? Hey, 10:58. It's moving ahead, but I don't want to cut anybody off.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Kyle, lead
Hi,
pastor. And so much of your stuff, great wisdom, and I've experienced a lot of some of the challenge that you're addressing. So this is really helpful for me. Thank you. I did have an experience of a very gifted associate who was also on the board for us, and it was difficult, that supervisor and shepherd. And that's something, so I'm definitely understanding. I'm trying to learn a lot about that. So there were some challenges on that. I guess my question, though, I want to kind of move forward. One question on our current staff, as a supervisor, trying to really shepherd them. One of the things that I'm trying to look at is caring for them. If there's any challenges or clarity with tasks or with amongst one another, I'm trying to definitely make myself available. The question is, I want to create a healthy support for them in the event that the staff has a conflict with me. Who do they go to? So if I'm overseeing them and if they have conflict with one of their colleagues, I could address that. But if there are conflict or difficulties with my leadership or my supervision, how do I create a safe place where they can feel supported and cared for if the problem is with me?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Excellent question, especially as we get more and more staff. I think one of the easy ways to handle that is to create a policy. I don't know, you know, if you have an employee handbook or, you know, anything where you have some kind of a policy that basically tells a subordinate ministry staff person or just staff person that if they have a problem with the lead pastor, that they are to, in fact, go to the lead pastor with that problem. And then if it's not resolved, that they are free to then contact, you know, a board member about that. But that they have to talk to the pastor first. There's an asterisk there that I'll mention. But if that's not satisfactory, that there is a way for the staff to get to the board. I think that's just healthy, and it also protects the pastor. But let me tell you the asterisk. The asterisk is things where there is an issue of abuse. Many a church bylaw says we won't accept an allegation against a pastor or elder except by 2 witnesses. And then I just ask them, if there's an allegation of abuse, how many zeros do you want to the left of the period in the settlement that's going to happen? Because you've just told the victims that they can't report it, because they have to have another witness. And so there are things like that I think we really need to clean up in our age. You know, that was certainly a biblical term, but, you know, the justice and systems and technologies and all that other stuff is different. If I have if I have a horribly, sexist, salacious, evil, picture from my pastor on my phone, I should be able to, I shouldn't have to have two witnesses, to do something with that. I ought to be able to just walk right up to a board member. Different boards are set up differently. I typically would say contact the board chairman. But I'm also one who believes that the chairman's job is not to be a super elder or have more authority than any others, but their job is to facilitate the work of the board. And so they would know which elder, but say prefer you contact the elder chairperson, but you feel free to contact any other elder, and so that you can have a hearing with the elders. But other than that, that abusive relationship kind of thing should always go through the lead pastor. Hey, thanks for joining on the call. If you have other questions or things like that, feel free to shoot me an email, bob.osborne@efca.org. Happy to work with you on that. Just a couple reminders for you. We have I'll be facilitating a couple of Zoom workshop or cohort learning things, 5 sessions of 2 hours each. One for what we're calling mid-level leaders, which is basically all ministry staff below the level of lead pastor. And then the second one we're doing is for board members or elders. Board members, elders will be at 6 o'clock at night on 5 Monday evenings between the end of March into May. And I think on the 11th, a Thursday afternoon, we start the first mid-level leadership thing. You can again go to EFCA West, one word, .org, and on the top banner, click on the word cohorts, and both of those come up. There's still time to sign up and participate in that. So, hey guys, gals, thanks for joining us and being part of this conversation. I as always, with the something to talk about stuff, I encourage you to just have the conversation, just a relaxed conversation with your board and with your staff members about, how can I, how can we help define and really support the relationship that I want to have with you as your pastor, as well as have with you as your leader. So thanks for being with us. Lord, thanks for a conversation. I trust that it was productive and will bear fruit in our ministries. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for being with us. Take care, everybody.